Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Learning Outcome 2 in terms of the unit, which is academic and research skills for law. With regards to, our session yesterday, we covered basic bits into understanding, our academic, competence, which was primarily related to the areas of our strengths and weakness and how is our language, English language academic skills in particular, which we had to evaluate or understand by doing a SWOT analysis with regards to looking at, finding out academic competence in English with regards to reading, writing, which is academic writing, and then looking at some of the journal skills around, our hard and soft skills. Now, we also looked at very briefly, the process through which we sometimes look at doing planning. And in this particular process of planning, we looked at SMART, which is an acronym for, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. And we use that technique essentially to inform and, develop or basically set, goals and objectives to be able to then, do away with our weaknesses and essentially our threats. Now, apart from that, what we also looked at was we looked at developing a personal development plan, which was basically done in the form of a PDP template. And this was primarily done to ensure that the areas of improvement, which is gap areas that we have discovered while doing our SWOT, could be then put into some sort of a working document. And that working document informs our personal progress with regards to improving on some of the goals and objectives which was set out in the SMART plan. Now, what we want to be able to do is basically look at a couple of things in Learning Outcome 2, and they would be with regards to understanding the areas of research. Why do we do research? What are the areas of research that we look at in terms of types of research? There could be various areas of research. These could be done primarily to study a competition, to study customers, to study or gather information, background information about a particular topic. And research essentially could be done, for a number of reasons. But research essentially is, when you look at the definition of the word research, it normally points to the fact that it is a systematic investigation that we take into and study the materials or the various sources in order to establish, and basically reach some conclusions. So when we look at doing research, what we want to be able to do is understand how this is done in the context of law, how and why is research important when we look at, legal documentation, preparation of cases that we do, and, how do we go about researching cases from various sources, when we need to draw parallels with regards to, drawing up documentation for legal purposes. In general, also, the topic of research is quite helpful because of the fact that it informs us in terms of how to go about collecting data or information from various sources in order to, come to some sort of meaningful conclusions. Not necessarily always, but generally data is gathered from various sources to be able to investigate the reasons or, issues or problems behind it, and how do we go about overcoming those problems. So in this particular learning outcome, we are looking at basically 3 assessment criteria. First would be to try and understand the process of carrying out primary research from different sources. And the second would be to carry out the process, or basically outline the process through which we carry out secondary research from different sources. And there's a distinction criteria which basically focuses on, for us to be able to put forward with examples that what constitutes good practice in primary and good practice in secondary research. So let's delve into some of these assessment criteria today with the help of some PowerPoint slides. I'm also going to be looking at showing you a video which basically looks at, what are research methods, and obviously, how do we go about conducting research, which is primarily to ensure that we understand that, the reasons of basically doing research stand, primarily, I would say, from a reason of understanding, as I mentioned earlier, into, basically finding out reasons into the background of why sometimes, some things occur, or the way in which they occur. And in general, you could be looking at basically finding out data about, your competition, customers, anything which in general, you feel is important. So let's look at, a video which particularly would inform us in terms of, why research primarily is done. So just give me 1 second, and I'm going to try and play that video, which hopefully should set the foundation for us to study the learning outcome too.
The questionnaire drafting process is the most delightful and challenging and heartbreaking part of the research process. The days we get data here, I call them Christmas in April or June or July. What I love about working at the Pew Research Center is that I get to have my hand on all the different phases of research. You start to look at the stuff and you go, oh wow, here are the stories we've got in our findings.
If you're interested in understanding how life is organized when people are really living it, then what you want to do is record it and then analyze it using conversational analysis. So if you have a silence of something like 1.9, then that tells you that whatever's just happened between the two speakers, there's something interesting going on.
The research I do tends to focus on data visualization, looking at data sets that are generated from social systems, cities, transport systems, and visualizing them, understanding them, analyzing them, and then communicating.
Anytime a byte gets taken away or slotted in, that registers on the system. So that enables you to track for an individual byte where it's been taken from, where it's been taken to, and exactly when that happened. Replication at this first level involves getting the data that the author got, following all the procedures that the author followed, and getting exactly the same tables and figures and numerical results.
As soon as you start theorizing about what I'm doing, you stop observing what I'm doing.
Traditionally, many of us who are ethnographers pay very close attention to the visual dynamics. You have the ability to capture motion with audio, and through editing, compress time and space. And that makes the medium itself, from a social science perspective, different and unique.
So this gives you a perspective that this, research, when we talk about, is basically a social science, and it's used in all all aspects of when we want to collect data, analyze data, and essentially, at some stage, look at using that data to inform in terms of decision-making process. So when we talk about research, research can be done for various reasons, as I mentioned earlier, but this is a science through which, data is analyzed, collected, distributed, and then, recollected back to be able to reach meaningful conclusions. Now, when we look at, various sources of primary research essentially means that when you observe or collect information firsthand, that means you are the one who is observing and collecting that information firsthand. When you look at, sometimes when we talk about that you're collecting data through survey or questionnaires, and because you're doing it, yourself or doing it firsthand, that would be termed as primary research. So data which is basically collected for research purposes directly from participants would also be a part of primary research. The objectives of any study that we do when we do a research project, which is a term I think I'm pretty sure you would have come across, or when you do research methods, another term which we normally come across on our day-to-day lives, what you will generally see is that this study actually defines, in terms of how data, is collected, whether through primary source or secondary source. And analysis is basically the calculation, the tabulation, and the presentation of that data in some meaningful form, which could be charts, graphs, tables, or some sort of thematic or visual analysis, which allows that information to be presented, which can be then understood by various target audiences, or for the purposes of audiences that you've created or collected that data. Now, primary data collection can essentially be done through in-depth interviews. It can be done through surveys. There are techniques like focus groups, and you can also basically collect data through social media monitoring. Now, there are these different methods which allow you to collect data, and these data collection methods essentially, differ slightly from differ slightly amongst each other. And the reason why that is that when you look at collecting data or information, sometimes you are collecting data qualitatively. That means you're basically looking at interviewing a few set of people to be able to gather their opinion and then use that for analysis. So in those cases, you would look at doing in-depth interviews and maybe focus groups, which is a small number of people that fit together in a particular demographic, and then you are looking at doing a discussion which would be captured to collect important data points. When you look at surveys and questionnaires in particular, you're trying to collect large amounts of data. So when you look at the census which happens for the population, wherein you are normally sent a questionnaire when you register and you vote, then when the population census is done and the data is collected, in those cases you would look at that we will make use of surveys and questionnaires, because we need to be looking at asking the right questions from a meaningful set of people, which will comprise or which will call them as sampling population, and that would then allow us to collect data which can then be again later analyzed to come out with meaningful conclusions. Now, there are some limitations and obviously advantages and disadvantages of doing primary research. Primary research can be done. One of the advantages is to collect specific information. Sometimes the data which is used for interpretation or produced for interpretation from the results of the collection of primary data is much more meaningful and better. Because you're collecting data firsthand, you have greater control on how the data is collected, so that you can negate out errors. And then sometimes you can also look at collecting data with respect to the topic at hand, which could be directly related to certain, say, talking points or points which are related to why the whole research is being done. On the other hand, because there is a personalized approach in terms of collecting primary data, it is time consuming, it is expensive. Sometimes the rate of response could be slower. So for example, if you send across a questionnaire to a number of participants, then you have to give them time to be able to respond. And in those cases, what you would see, sometimes the response rate is low. You have to remind them to be able to participate. And obviously, in some cases, the participants also have an option to opt out of the research totally. And one of the other disadvantages that we generally see that, it requires a lot of experience to be able to analyze that data, which would mean that in some cases, researchers or people who are looking at doing primary research need to be aware of the advanced, statistical techniques like SPSS, regression analysis, to be able to tabulate the data in the right format for it to be presented to get meaningful results. And there is an element of interview bias, which can also be linked to the collection of primary data, because if you fail to record or fail to accurately record certain aspects of the interview or focus group that you're doing, then in those cases it can lead to a bit of bias or data points slipping. Now, when we talk about the process of carrying out the research through secondary resources, what we mean by that in that case is that we are going to be looking at essentially collecting data from data points which could be from another source, and there is no direct interaction with regards to with the data or the participants that you are collecting it from. So a simple example of this would be that if you were traveling and you were traveling and you witnessed an accident. So in this case, when you witness the accident happening when you're traveling in the bus, that is your primary source because you witnessed it firsthand. But when you talk about this in the office, when you reached office and you talk about this to your colleagues, when they get this information, they are getting it from a secondary source. That means a secondary source would mean that in the second person, because you are narrating the incident which you saw and they are hearing it from you. And sometimes when this is on the news that you get to hear, then in those cases, the data or the news that you get to hear about the incident which happened is being heard on as a third party, and in those cases, those particular data points would be then termed as tertiary. So sometimes when you pick up a newspaper, and if you buy it today, then in that case, you're looking at primary data. If you buy that newspaper a couple of days down the line, when the date has elapsed, that would become tertiary data, because the news would have been the news that you the news points that you get to read in the newspaper have become old, and obviously there are other sources from this same information can be pulled. So in this case, a newspaper then becomes a tertiary source of data sometimes. Now, secondary collection of data can be qualitative and quantitative. And sometimes when you look at quantitative and qualitative, because if you have to collect data from a number of sources, then sometimes you have to apply techniques which will allow you to analyze that data mathematically. And that is where quantitative techniques or data collection methods come in. And when you look at qualitative data, which is basically looking at data collection from certain sources, which could be government, say, for example, archives, or public records, then in those cases, those data points are more reliable. And what you're looking at doing is collecting it from one source only. And in that case, that would be qualitative. Now, examples of secondary source of data could be government publications and statistics. You look at industry association reports. You look at websites. You could look at annual journal reports. You look at printed market research reports. You look at reading or getting data from books or journals and articles, and they will all be comprising these secondary, sources of data. Now, there are obviously some advantages and disadvantages of, the methods of, secondary sources, or, the process through which you collect data for secondary research. The advantages tend to be that because the source of data can be accessed from many places, so the collection of this data is less time consuming. And sometimes the limitation on the opposite end tends to be that the information becomes outdated. So the example that I gave you of the newspaper, if you buy the newspaper today, then obviously, yes, it's a secondary source and it is reliable and it is, current. But the moment you buy a newspaper which is a couple of days old, then in that case, the information contained in that paper could be outdated. Now, secondary data has many sources. As you can see, there are lots of ways through which you can collect data. Obviously, in some cases, when you are required to do desk-based research, which is also called secondary research, then in those cases, what tends to happen is your resource requirements generally tend to be low. The costs involved are less because you are able to source data electronically from published sources, and there is no direct, or in some cases, indirect cost involvement. And then you can also look at getting large amounts of secondary data which could be used, for carrying out or doing statistical analysis, and that could be, say, an example of when the population census is done. That is, primary data, because the population census is being, done through the involvement of local councils, various agencies, the government organization in general, and that is done once in 10 years because it is expensive and it is done firsthand. But when you use the population census data to do further analysis, which could be to look at demographics, look at breakup of the Black, Asian, minority, ethnic population in the overall population of UK. You look at how the population trends are distributed across various cities, how the population is spread across the 4 devolved nations. What you're looking at doing is basically picking up the census data, and from that large amount of data, you're looking at doing further analysis, and that sometimes, requires detailed statistical, knowledge, which would mean that you're looking at using advanced statistical techniques like SPSS. You're looking at using techniques like regression analysis, ANOVA, to be able to do, tabulations or calculations and then present meaningful conclusions from that data which public or the audience can understand. Now, the limitations tend to be that sometimes you collect data for a non-specific purpose, and data points can be vague. You can look at that sometimes you have no control over the quality of data which is being used to do this research, because you're relying on research reports or reports or publications which have already collected this data, so there is no way that there is correction possible at the source, which can be done because the data has already been collected. So from that aspect, when you look at the secondary sources of research that we do, sometimes you're required to do research on the basis of secondary sources. And a practical example that I would give you here would be that imagine you work within an organization, and there are lots of reports which are published on a daily basis, but on one of the days your boss, your manager is asking you to prepare a summary report to identify, say, for example, the hot selling trends of 2021. So what you are going to do is essentially, because he's asked you to prepare a report or a presentation, you're not going to be going down the route of collecting primary data or going out into the market and distribute surveys and questionnaires. What you're going to do is obviously from your desk in the office, you're going to log into either websites which will provide this data like Statistica. You will go to Kantar. You'll probably go to sites wherein some of these reports are available. And from there, you will download these reports and then study and analyze them, and then pick out the data points which are related to what has been asked, and then prepare a presentation to present that. So in those cases, you're looking at doing secondary research, and that is what would be that is what we generally see as happening in our day-to-day work lives. When we are required to collect data, we are required to collect information, we are required to then analyze that, synthesize that, and then present that in a format which is going to be meaningful for decision making. Now, just to briefly look at summarizing, when we do market research, what are the reasons that we do market research? We do market research for various reasons. It could be to investigate, to try and find out what are the reasons behind why this error is happening or why this problem is occurring or reoccurring. But this can be done in two different ways. One could be primary sources that we depend on to collect this information, and the second would be secondary sources that we depend on for collection of this information. And the reasons of doing the research always tend to be looking at doing an investigation to come to some sort of a meaningful conclusion of why these things are happening, or why a certain problem is being faced. And research, as I mentioned earlier, could be done for n number of reasons. You might be working in a company in marketing or sales. You might be working within administration, engineering, production, within an organization. You work within a construction agency or a construction firm. And there could be various reasons of why you would be required to, do research in terms of collecting data, and that would be then presented as meaningful information to your colleagues or your peers. And the various ways of doing that is through the primary route and through the secondary route. So when we look at market research data, facts and figures are collected through secondary sources and through primary sources. Primary because it is you're collecting the information firsthand. Secondary because this is being collected from a published resource or a location from which the data or from a location where the data has already been presented. And when we summarize the different methods through which research is carried out, we look at primary methods and secondary methods. And this particular slide then summarizes how and when these activities are done and what elements they involve, and some examples to cover off the second learning outcome. At this stage, I'll ask questions. So any questions from you, Johnson? Any questions at your end, Johnson?
It's clear.
Okay, that's brilliant. So basically today's discussion—
It's clear, Rahman.
It is clear. Okay, that's great. So today's discussion was slightly brief because there were only two assessment criteria, and the idea here is to try and relate to what are the reasons that we end up doing research. And we come across these terms called research methods or advanced research. And, sometimes the collection of information, for the purposes of analysis to try and get to the bottom of a problem, or to find out, say, for example, the reasons why this problem is occurring, we always look at conducting, research. And in terms of the reason why this is, as a social science, very important is because we use research in all aspects of our life, whether it's marketing, so it's called marketing research. You look at using this in health and social care. It will be, related to healthcare research. So research is an important part in discovering. When we look at, say, for example, currently we are in the COVID-19 pandemic, and as you can see, a lot of R&D. We hear this term, research and development, has been done by pharmaceutical companies to come out with the vaccine. They've gone through various phases of trial, the first phase, the second phase, the third phase of trial, which has then allowed certain vaccines to be approved, and they are now being used for vaccination. So there was a lot of research which has been done into the study of understanding the virus. So in this context, and then the scientists have been able to isolate the genome and the ribonucleic acid of the virus, and then basically mute that, and that part of it is being used, in some part of the vaccination, which is currently being done across the globe. So research is very important to find answers to things which are unknown, trying to find answers to areas that we don't have knowledge about, which could be gaps, and in some cases, also trying to understand in terms of building knowledge and facilitating learning. So research can be done for many reasons. It has many angles to it, and it's a very vast subject, which is very important from a point of view of from a student's perspective, because research allows us to develop critical thinking. The reason why this unit is important, specifically within the law context, is that when you look at preparing legal documentation, you are going to be looking at studying into a lot of case laws, which would be required to draw documentation when you are preparing it for a client or for a solicitor or for a barrister, which is to be presented in the court of law. And sometimes you would need to know the techniques through which you can do research, and this research technique or basically the subject or the topic of research would then allow you to develop critical thinking and hopefully help you develop expertise to be able to find law and law cases from law gazettes and from previous hearings which have happened in the court, and they as a result allow you to draw parallels to preparing the documentation. Sometimes you see an example that I would give you in the case of law would be that sometimes in the past, if judicial reviews have happened in the High Court and the plaintiff, or the defendant, between the two of them, if one of them has won, judicial review is normally done, when you are basically going to go and represent that you have not got justice and you will go against the government machinery. So judicial reviews would challenge some of the public laws which the state uses to drive order, while conducting their functions within any country. So when you do a judicial review, and in this case, when you file a judicial review and you go and you win that judicial review, what will happen is that will become a reference for such cases which would arise in the future, and for referencing those cases into the documentation side that you are preparing. Sometimes you would need to do that, and in those cases, the research topic in general would allow you to do, or develop critical thinking and allow you to then look at finding those similar cases which can be used in your preparation of that documentation, and that makes the case or winning of that case or presentation of the facts of that case easier. So research is an important topic or an important science essentially, and in this context of this unit, what we want to understand is what are primary sources of data, what are secondary sources of data, and in what circumstances do we do primary research, and in what circumstances do we do secondary research. So with this, probably I will end this session today, because we've covered the basic essence of what we needed to look at in Learning Outcome 2, and the idea would be to look at, going through the bits which are on Moodle, this particular presentation, and the video that I've shown from Sage Research at the start of this particular discussion today would give you some idea into why research is considered a science, why it is very important, and why it is something which touches us in all facets of our life. Any questions at your end, Johnson?
It's clear, Rahman. It's
Okay,
well
that's
understood.
brilliant. So in terms of the learning outcome 2, we've got the presentation here. I'm going to upload the latest copy of the recording, and there is, in the assignment brief, if I just quickly relate that to what we see is in the assignment brief, just briefly looking at, in this particular task, what we've got 2.1, 2.2. So here, this is going to be used. We're not going to do that, but I'll tell you that this learning outcome 2 that we have covered today will be studied in effect with learning outcome 4 and learning outcome 5. So essentially here at this stage, we want to know what are the methods, why it is used, how data is collected through primary and secondary. And then when we look at drafting a piece of research in learning outcome 4 and producing and presenting that piece of work in learning outcome 5, that is where we'll actually use these, basically to understand this in a bit more detail. So thanks for attending, and I will catch up with you tomorrow.